Any thoughts on what we just saw with regard to destroying these old cultures and old traditions? You're right. I'm saying hundreds. I should be saying thousands of years old.
Yeah, it's totally destruction. It's just wiped clean. So when I was starting school, basically anything before the Cultural Revolution it's gone. I mean, it's all we know is some bad things, right? Nothing is good before the Cultural Revolution, and Mao is the savior. Mao actually was worshipped as a god, as the god actually. So, yeah, it's really during the Cultural Revolution. What we went through is really just like what he said. It's a religion. Everything's like that. Basically, Chairman Mao's words became...
His words were truth. They were the divine truth.
Yeah. Basically, whatever the book he wrote, those are the Bible, right?
Yeah. Well, that's a brilliant point, and that leads us into our next thing, which is you see in all these pictures. So there's a couple of things visually that come to mind when you invoke the Cultural Revolution. One of them is the armbands.
Yeah.
The other is the big character posters. But one of the most conspicuous things is the little red.
Right. You have to memorize, basically recite his work. So I'm still kind of, to this day, I still remember some of that.
Well, and probably a little bit. So I know. The things that we become indoctrinated with as kids just kind of become part of us, and they pop out every once in a while. We just can't forget it. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at what they have to say about the Little Red Book.
This is the time the Little Red Book becomes the indispensable fashion accessory for every right-thinking Chinese, for the Red Guards and for their leaders, with the sole exception of the chairman himself. Compiled by Lin Biao from Mao's writings as a set of moral maxims for the army, it quickly became a breviary of revolutionary virtue for the country at large. For the fortunate few, the nec plus ultra is a Little Red Book signed by Mao himself. For everyone else, it's a talisman, an emblem of ideological zeal.
I 就觉得，怎么说呢？毛就是好像就是真理的化身，所以对他说的就是深信不疑。所以他说谁是坏人，大家就觉得他是坏人。就是毛主席，当时毛主席就是林彪说的，毛主席句句话是真理，10000句一句顶10000句。当时确实是谁也不敢怀疑他。 我在我接触的人里头没有说是敢怀疑他的，有个别人有一点怀疑，那大家就觉得这个人是个怪物，是个危险分子，是个野兽，是个另类，他没法生存。
So we can see in that clip and those examples that, Lin Biao, who was Mao's right-hand man at the time, head of the military, had collected these quotes into a little red book. It was portable, it was small, it could fit in the pocket. He started having the people in the military read from it every day, and it became a way of virtue signaling in the context of the time. You waved the book, you possessed the book, you were reading from it, and it showed that you were in good standing, trying to pursue Mao Zedong thought. You were thinking right. It was a way to virtue signal right think.
Yeah.
And we can see those types of performance virtue signaling now in the context of social media, whether it's putting a particular profile picture that tends to trend, or saying the right things, using the right hashtag, using the right buzzwords that signal to other people that you're thinking the right way. Anything else come to mind about the Little Red Book and some of the stuff that we just saw?
Yeah, that was basically, like you said, you have to have it. If you don't have it, then you'll be in trouble. I mean, so
yeah, there's no way for you to hold place in society if you don't have it.
right. And not only you have to have his book, you also have his button. Like you wear his, with his, profile, you wear the button. Sometimes you wear several, just show you how loyal you are to the great chairman. It's really a cult. It's the kind of religious.
It's very religious in the way that it affects people's lives, in the way that they have to show expression. It's almost like instead of worship to God, it's worship to Mao.
Oh yeah.
Instead of clothings of piety, it's, the right badge and the right book.
Exactly. Well, when actually, when I went to Canada, when I went to a church, people kind of introduced us to the church and see what they were doing. And that actually reminded me of what's happening in the Cultural Revolution. It's kind of like, it's kind of a traumatic experience to see the church in Canada and remind me what's happening in the Cultural Revolution.
Okay.
You can stay from church for as long as that.
I kind of have a similar experience. I came out of what I see as a high demand religion that was kind of took over my whole life.
Right.
And I've become involved in some of the community outreach of a local Lutheran church.
Mm-hmm.
But when I go to their Sunday ceremony, their Sunday worship, as I have on occasion, everybody's chanting and repeating in the same line. And I'm just like, I can't, because I went through like temple ritual and things that does that. And it doesn't sit right with me. And so I can relate to like, oh, this is too much like the thing I escaped.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But that tells you what's going on at that time. Is like every household has a Mao statue. You has Mao's portrait. You basically kind of like you're praying to him, right? And and if he did something wrong, you have to apologize to him. If you have bad thought, it's whole kind of, you have to be, pure in terms of ideology.
Which reminds me of religious people that are brought up with, if you have sinned and offend God, you say a prayer to ask for forgiveness. And I've listened to multiple people who grew up under Mao that say that as kids, they kind of did that. If they had a bad thought, they would ask Mao, apologize and do that just in their heart, in their head. So that's interesting. The other thing that they bring up is this idea that you have to study in the morning and report at night. You always have to be doing the work of making sure that you're shaping your life in accordance with the ideology of Mao. And we're starting to hear more and more of the rhetoric of you have to constantly be doing the work in the way that current social forces are saying how we have to be in order to be right. They don't use class struggle. We're seeing different ways to divide society be the language of how these conflicts take shape in the way that our societies are working. So, Marx described dividing society by class and looking at the conflicts between those classes, exploiting those conflicts in order to change and shape society. We're seeing people now divide society much more rigidly along race and along gender ideology and along different ways of stratifying society and then accentuating the conflicts that happen there and then using a political lens, an ideological lens to say how we resolve that conflict. And that's what we're starting to see.
Right, exactly. And the idea is the same. You divided the people into two classes. One is oppressor, one is oppressed. And it's always this kind of struggle between the classic Marxism is between the classes, right? Between people who have, people who hadn't. But nowadays it's really between not just black and white. It's also had this kind of intersectionality. They are trying push, like if you are gay, then you are being oppressed. Or if you are some kind of a minority, you get oppressed. But if you are white and male, and especially you are straight male, then you are the oppressor.
It's just like being a landlord or a rich peasant or the bourgeoisie back then. Those are forms of privilege. And, back then it was the privileged class that were used to ramp up any degree of resentment or any degree of sin in the past, and then use that to further a particular political ideology.
Right. Yeah. I mean, at first, of course, they pick on people who are really rich, right? I mean, the capitalists and the own factories and all that. But pretty soon they get done mean. Once they are gone, what are you going to do? Then you go pick up, only have like a little piece of land, not maybe just half an acre, and then you become the landlord. And same thing here, because now if you are white and you're male, I mean, you are bad. Even though you haven't do anything, right? You haven't done any of those oppression. I mean, even if you are liberal, but we have actually, there is a school district not far from us. The superintendent actually sent out the email denouncing his whiteness. What's going on here, right?
Well, and that's very similar to the stories that when you read the accounts of these struggle sessions where people are condemned, in many cases, the accounts say, well, yeah, they were in the jet position, their heads were bowed, their arms were behind them, and they were agreeing with the people that were condemning them. They were shouting out that they were wrong, they were bad, they were sinful, because you have to play in that ideology if you want to fit. And we're seeing, the social forces that took hold of China by storm here, they have their seeds in the way that we as human beings and the way our brains work in communities that can ignite around any particular ideology that has the same features of dividing us and pitting us against each other based on concepts of privilege.
Right.
And we're just seeing a different form of it now.
Right.
It happened in the French Revolution. It happened in Russia. It happened in China. It's just each one of these instances has its own shape, its own flavor, its own cultural context.
Yeah. And also once you get into it, I mean, there's no guarantee you will be safe. I mean, you could be the guy who is denouncing the other people one day, the next day, you'll be the guy who have been denounced. I mean, this thing, if you let start it, there is no end to it, right? I mean, nobody can escape.
That's why people call it a circular firing squad.
Yeah.
Everybody in a circle pointing and accusing each other. And at some point, you're going to be accused in the same way that you're accusing somebody else. As long as we allow mob justice to rule, where all it takes is an accusation. There's no call for evidence.
No.
There's no standards of evidence. There's no, careful evaluation of the circumstances. That's what's so important about the judicial system, is its ability to weigh the evidence and weigh things in favor of not condemning people, so that there has to be a clear standards for when people are actually convicted of crimes.
Right. Yeah. And now it's become like like what's happening in the Cultural Revolution. First, it was starting with something you did, right? Maybe you are a landowner and maybe you said you did some bad thing. And then it become like you said the bad way, the word. You said the wrong thing. And then it become like you thought the wrong thing. I mean, just like the progression is getting there. And we starting to see that, right?
Yeah.
If you
not only that, but
you may not only say something now, maybe you say something wrong 20 years ago.
Yes.
They can.
No, that's such a good point. Yeah. So there were instances in the Cultural Revolution where somebody wrote something during the 100 Flowers campaign. And that sin back then is invoked in the midst of the Cultural Revolution to condemn them as rightist. And so we're seeing that now where tweets are pulled up from several years ago or from someone who was a kid back then and was just, shooting his mouth off, and you bring that up and you condemn them for it in the present term.
Right.
Not only that, but then the ideas are changing. Something that would be considered wrong think now may have been accepted just a year ago, and people would have talked commonly about those things. But now that they're wrong think now, you can bring those things from the past into the present and condemn them.
Exactly.
On top of that, art and culture now become under the microscope of this ideological lens. And there's accounts of artists who drew pictures where Mao was standing in front of a cliff. And because that could be interpreted as Mao has no way to go forward, then that artist himself is struggled against.
Yeah.
Or, a printing says that there's a few X's on some of Mao's hair that might be a bad sign or something. And so the artist who created that is then struggled against. And what it ends up happening is that art and culture and literature comes to a standstill.
Right.
People cannot create movies or plays or books.
Yeah.
I think that there's one statistic that's like only 10 new original books came out in the decade of the Cultural Revolution, because you can't create when you're under this type of force where any ideological variance condemns you.
Right. We have those so-called the 8 model plays. Yeah, I mean, it's basically that's all we had during those 10 years of Cultural Revolution. You just watched, you got sick of it. You just watched it over and over. And then they have a variations based on that. It used to be awful. I'm now they're going to make that into, a different form of but it's based on the same thing. I mean, it's just like,
yeah. You're describing something that, it was eventually described as the Gang of Four, and there were 4 people in power working with Mao that included Mao's wife, Jiang Cheng, and they held such control over propaganda, over culture, including the arts, that the only thing they allowed, there's this notion when you get into strict religious paradigms or political paradigms that everything has to serve the authority. Everything has to serve either the political or the religious authority. So a play, a movie, a book is not of any value if it does not directly reinforce and uphold the ideology.
Right.
And that is taken so strictly that the only plays that are allowed are these model plays, these model operas that you're describing. And those operas only deal with the rise of the Communist Party, various events that happened in history, glorifying them and giving them a propagandistic spin that just reinforces the political ideology.
Exactly.
And so that's where, from the top down, they're basically saying nothing else can be created. Your artistic expression can't do anything other than that.
Yeah,
but there's also bottom up ways of constraining people where you can no longer have a movie that doesn't depict certain classes in certain way, or certain races or certain genders in some way, because it doesn't fit or conform to the ideology that's now shaping how we're going to design our culture. And when these political forces start to control the creativity and the expression of individuals in the society, it just ends up stultifying them, and you end up only getting drab things that play to that ideology, and the people hate it. Like I think people, once the Gang of Four was finally removed from power and placed under trial, there were like celebrations. Because people realized that they could start to express themselves again.
Right. Exactly.
That reign was over.
Right. Yeah. And here's actually one kind of example. During the Cultural Revolution, you cannot even say Mao can live to 100 years. You cannot say that.
Oh, because it's predicting his death?
No, because how dare
Wait 100 years?
I mean, he's going, he's going to live like...
He could live 1,000 years.
Yeah.
But even 1,000, that's too short.
Yeah. You have to thousands of thousands.
Oh, that's crazy.
It's just crazy. I mean, yeah. You nobody dared to say anything they believe that is true. You basically, you have to lie to anyone, even to your kids, because the parents are afraid that their kids could,
Oh, this is actually a very good point. Yeah. So people have described the Cultural Revolution as tearing at the very fabric of society, such that you lost your personal relationships because you began to distrust them. And that went even into the family for the very reason that you just mentioned, where the kids are going to schools, they're getting indoctrinated by this ideology, and they're told you need to report on any place that you hear this, especially your parents.
Right.
And so now the parents, if they're at home and they're just talking and they don't like the food rationing, they don't like something, and they say it and the kids see it, then the kid can turn in the parent who will then be struggled against. Right. And they may lose their position if they have a place of employment, they lose their standing in their community, or as perhaps happened to your family, they may lose their place of living and be sent away somewhere else.
Right.
Now, this would be a hard feeling for most of us to imagine, but an elderly man in China recently told local media that he regrets contributing to his mother's death about 40 years ago. And that was during China's Cultural Revolution, a really terrible time in China's modern history. And even though he feels regret now, at the time, he actually didn't feel like he was doing anything wrong.
这里就是母亲的墓地。
Zhang Hongbing's mother lies meters from the spot where she was executed in the Cultural Revolution. The years of upheaval and destruction Mao unleashed claimed perhaps 1 million lives. Even so, Fang Dongmo's case stands out. It was her zealous teenage son who denounced her as a counter-revolutionary.
So at the time, Zhang was actually part of a group called the Red Guards, which is a movement led by young people during the 1970s in support of Mao's policies and the communist regime at that time. So basically, his mother had disagreed with Mao's policies, so he wrote her name down and gave it to the Red Guards, saying that she should be executed. And after 2 months, she was executed.
One night, the teenager thought his mother spoke of Mao disrespectfully. In the furious row that broke out, she called for the return of purged leaders and attacked Mao for creating a personality cult.
我们就对他进行批判斗争，但是母亲不服气，她仍然把家庭里面挂着的毛泽东画像等等，把它撕下来烧毁。哎，在这中间，父亲和我先后到公检法军官组报案。母亲，没有辩护律师，在不到2个月的时间，就被定为反革命罪，执行枪决了。
He did feel guilt inside of him, but he felt like he did the right thing.
And to me, this was kind of indicative of the society at that time. He was only 16 years old, but because of all these fanatical things that were going on to support Mao Zedong, he felt that anyone who opposed Mao Zedong would be an enemy, including his own mother.
在文革中间，有一首歌叫做《爹亲娘亲不如毛主席亲》。这首歌是这样的：天大地大，不如党的恩情大；爹亲娘亲不如毛主席亲；千好万好，不如社会主义好。 河神海神，这个相册是我家里面的相册，这张照片是我们的全家福，这是我的母亲。
At the time, children were actually encouraged to denounce their parents if they were not in favor of the party.
这种关系，特别是我母亲这个案件发生的当天晚上，这种亲情就完全没有了，变成了一个血淋淋的。 阶级关系。
When Mao's Cultural Revolution convulsed the country in 1966, Zhang's family embraced it. His parents had first met after enlisting in the revolutionary cause. Neither that nor their initial enthusiasm would help them.
我母亲因为她的家庭成分和她父亲所谓的历史反革命的原因，而被当作地主分子和国民党特务嫌疑被隔离审查。 长达2年之久。
As the years gone by, he really came to terms with what he did. Sometimes he dreams about her, and he's saying that sometimes he sees her in his sleep, and he would hold her hands and say, "Forgive me," but she wouldn't look at him. And it's actually really sad.
经过43年的反思，我现在认识到自己当年做错了，我现在应该向母亲道歉，并且应该向母亲。 忏悔。
Imagine a generation of kids being brought up with this kind of mentality where they can go and criticize the closest people in their lives. And since this news came out, Chinese netizens have chimed in on what they feel about it. And some people were saying, you know, it was really a product of that society, but other people were saying he was responsible still for his own actions. But I guess as more and more people reflect upon that particular period, maybe there will be things done to make sure something like that doesn't actually happen again.
Mm-hmm.
我认为，文革是一场导致中华民族劫难的浩劫，应该记住这个惨痛的历史教训，绝不能让它重演。
There's so much at stake that then people start to close off. They don't want to share their own private opinions with anyone.
Right. You don't even share with your own spouse because you're afraid that your spouse might report you to the government. I mean, there's just no trust anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, that whole concept of trust, I think it's hard to understand why there was so much widespread suicide until you try to put yourself in the seat of people who have lost all of this thing that we take for granted, this social acceptance that we have in our family, our community, our churches, all these different things give us a sense of belonging and a sense of acceptance. And when all of that is torn down, so you can't even trust your spouse or your children, and you feel alone and you're an island, and maybe you're thinking maybe you're the only one who sees the problem with everything.
What here is like, this is what you do in that situation. You basically force yourself not to think. And there was a term, it's called thought liberation after the Cultural Revolution, which means that now you can think freely. But people are not used to that. People has to go through kind of, in a way, a therapy or something to actually be able even to dare to think something different. That's something, it's very hard. I mean, 1984, that's actually, ways brilliant to be able to describe to the Western world what's it like. But
yeah,
it's still different when you're in that. I mean, literally, you dare not to think. Everything has to follow the party line. Yeah. And then the party line get changed every time. So you have to get updated.
And it doesn't matter if the current party line contradicts the past party line. The only thing that matters is what the party says today. So all of those things like doublethink and newspeak, where the language itself has to be shaped to conform to the ideology. Orwell was spot on with that. And we see that reflected in Russia, in Germany, in any place where totalitarianism takes hold, where the rights of the individual are overtaken by this authoritarian control. The metaphor of the boot on the head forever that is invoked in that novel is very, very spot on.
Yeah, there's actually a famous picture. I think it was Mao was receiving Zhou Enlai when Zhou Enlai came back from a foreign visit. And so you have a picture there. And after the Cultural Revolution, then there's a new person popped up in the picture. Then after a while, another person picked up. Another person popped up.
So they're erasing the history in the photos, modifying the photos. We saw Stalin do that in Russia as well, where they go in, even in the age before Photoshop.
Right.
They're changing the history. Yeah.
Right.
Well, let's see. There was one last video I wanted to show. There's actually a lot more we could cover in this. It'll just take some time. But all of this stuff is happening in China, but word is getting out, and people who identify with Mao and his perspective and his calls to action in other countries were also acting on it. And there's a brilliant little clip that describes this. I had never seen it in any other context that I want to bring out now. Let's take a look at this. This is what's happening in London as the Cultural Revolution is taking shape.
Elsewhere, particularly in London, self-proclaimed members of the Red Guard staged scenes from China, giving the outside world an idea of the deadly, serious nature of the Cultural Revolution. The young were obsessed, fanatical, and incapable of communicating.
Are you staying here the whole weekend? Would you like to translate?
Down with British imperialism! Long live Chairman Mao! Long live Chairman Mao!
Long live Chairman Mao!
In return for the humiliation in Hong Kong, members of the Red Guard took their revenge on the British representatives in Beijing. The police withdrew their forces and let the violence run its course. Rioters took the British Reuters correspondent hostage.
The diplomatic mission of Great Britain in China was stormed and set alight. The diplomats were dragged out, and at a revolutionary demonstration, they were publicly humiliated in accord with Red Guard ritual. You can't exactly say for sure that Mao gave specific instructions for that. No, he didn't do that. But this revolution was a game of who was the best revolutionary of them all.
All right. I love that quote at the end. You can see where these ideas started revolution in other places. And if you look at history, there's these conflicts that happen in other countries like France, where students take up some of the same ideas and start to rebel against the authorities in their area. Wherever these ideas take hold, where you take what people have called Marx conflict theory and you start to divide whatever society you're in into oppressors and oppressed, and then you start to foment revolution based on that. We saw that in the British Embassy. You can see what's happening in China, and the statement at the end where this is a game, and the game is who can be more revolutionary than anyone else. That implies and encodes a performative element to it, that when you have large masses of people in a mob acting on an ideological lens that has a moral vector, meaning that there's a good and a bad, then it just amps up people competing to be the most good. And the most good is expressed by whatever the most harm that you can do to the things that are bad.
Yeah, and also when there is a group of people together, many times it seems that there is a spirit there getting hold of the people. Like normally people individually, they won't behave like that.
Yeah.
But in a group, they'll become...
There's some sort of mass hysteria, people have called it.
Right.
Something takes a hold of them.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that even when the people who were themselves involved in it, when they reflect on it, there's a number of things that happen. In some cases, people block it out and they deny that they were involved in it.
Yeah.
And they don't want to acknowledge that it was within them. And I think Alexander Solzhenitsyn, there's a very famous quote of him where he talks about the line between good and bad running through the heart of each of us. Each of us in these contexts may be capable of committing these atrocities because we don't know how we will behave in the milieu of a mob in the context of a righteous crusade under a particular ideological lens, how we would behave. It's not only the religious fervor in which you commit actions, but also the knowledge of the consequences of speaking out against the mob. And we're starting to see now throngs of people marching through various streets, raising their fist in an act of revolution against what they see as, oppressive elements of our society. And there's so many parallels with what we're seeing happen in China that you start to understand why people like yourself are raising the call to say, wait a second, we need to step back, learn from our history, see what's happening here. Because if this is the same social forces, the same ideological forces that are driving this, then we need to step back and ask ourselves, is this where we want to have our society head? Right. How do you then nip it in the bud? How do you stop these ideas from taking hold? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that we already get to the last defense, is that those ideologies are pushing down to the K through 12 education. I mean, so far at this point, it's still mainly stayed in colleges, on college campuses. But now we see that they are trying to push down. So even though they don't teach like critical race theory, but it was applied. I mean, the ideology has been, applied to pretty much every aspect of our education. And once those kids get indoctrinated, then we have a monster on our hand. I mean, that's how Mao was kind of used those youth. I mean, even though it started with college students, but then it spread to high school and middle school. And actually was the middle school students was doing the most damage.
In China?
In China.
That's actually one of the things that was really surprising to me when I started to read about this, because I'm used to, college students, they go crazy. They're physical, they're bigger, they can do violence and everything like that. But the first murder of a school teacher in Beijing was a middle school.
Right.
And it was a girls' school.
Right.
And these girls who had formed themselves as Red Guards acted on an accusation that was made against their principal and struggled and tortured her over several days, invaded her home, put up big character posters. And then on a subsequent day, when she didn't think that they were going to do anything worse than that, they drug her out and started beating her with clubs.
Right.
And they ended up killing her.
Right.
And that story of it, because there's a video clip of somebody putting a red armband on Chairman Mao in Tiananmen Square in one of these mass demonstrations. And that the girl who put that on was a girl from that school who was in charge of the Red Guard organization of this school that killed this teacher.
Yeah.
And that story was actually made into a documentary called Though I Am Gone. And if you're open to it, I'd love to have you back to go through that documentary and explore a little bit more what happened there. But it just shows you that these ideas can transform even girls in middle school into violent actors, because when we act on these ideologies that have a moral dimension to it, where we can feel righteous and justified for committing acts of violence in the name of a cause that we've been told is good, it just completely changes what we're capable of. And I think the fear that you and other parents have of a divisive ideology making its way into K through 12 school is that we're going to start having these divisive ways of thinking that call out and dehumanize segments of society as oppressors, and that dehumanization then justifies anything that we might do against them,
Right.
Depriving them of the same sort of rights that you would otherwise have other people enjoy.
Right.
That's a really bad precedent, a really bad pathway for us to go on as a nation.
Yeah, I think that's why a lot of Chinese Americans who have experienced cultural revolution would get alarmed, because now this ideology is pushed down to the K to 12. I mean, not just in public schools, many private schools also have that.
Yeah.
And so I think if we don't do anything, then we're going to have big problem. I mean, the kids at that age, you don't really understand what you're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people who later on really regret it and was traumatized by what they did, because at that age, you simply just don't understand it.
Yeah. Yeah, you have no concept. I think in America, we enjoy a lot of things that we take for granted. The diversity of thought, the ability of other people to have completely divergent views and opinions, and that our system that allows these things to coexist and not dominate one another is part of what affords us our freedom. And as soon as we allow one ideology to take center stage and to overwhelm everything else,
Right.
and label anyone who thinks any other way as bad, wrong, repulsive, all these other ways of labeling them to dehumanize them,
Right.
then it tears down those aspects of our culture that have allowed us to be stable and allows us to enjoy freedom with people that have all sorts of different views and perspectives and are able to conduct their lives according to their own personal conscience and their own personal choice.
Right.
I have a special place in my heart now for Chinese immigrants who are starting to speak up about this, because your experience is so relevant and your voice is so powerful in really raising this warning call. And I'm so thankful that you were able to take time out of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity, and also get to see those clips. And a lot of them actually, to me, it's the first time to seeing it.
Oh, okay. Well, I've scoured the internet and I've tried to find the best quality version of all these different documentaries. I'm hoping to make some of this stuff available to the extent that YouTube will let me. But in the meantime, if I can get you to come back again, I'd actually originally intended to have us watch a oral history project where different survivors from many different regions in the Cultural Revolution talk about their experience, where maybe you could give us a little bit of background and context to what they're talking about. And if I can get you to come back again,
that definitely could.
Part of it, I just feel like it was really important for us to lay the groundwork of trying to understand exactly what happened, especially at that early part of the Cultural Revolution. We still have to get to the being sent down to the countryside, because that's another very important part of what took place. But
yeah, I mean, I try to forget it, right? Because once you go through that process, the traumatic experience, you tend to let it go and just forget about it, never touch it again, right? But now, my kind of actually since May this year, I started to kind of review what happened in China, trying to understand Cultural Revolution, from a historical perspective. Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to, we can go through that together.
So, all right. Well, that's great. Dr. Ping, thank you so much for joining us. We've had a great discussion talking about how ideology has taken over and swept through a nation, really transforming the relationships between people in a way that was divisive, that dissolved the whole human social interactions and trust that people have, and just want to understand this so that we can see what steps we can take to prevent that type of phenomenon happening here in America and in other places. So thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff.
Yeah.
Mao.